My name is Elena. I'm 48 years old, though some days I feel like time stopped for me at 30. It's strange, isn't it? How you carry this image of yourself in your mind that doesn't quite match the mirror anymore. I live alone in a cozy apartment on the quieter side of town. My days are simple. Work at the bookstore, evenings spent reading or knitting by the window, weekends reserved for coffee at my favorite cafe. A quiet, predictable life. But last Tuesday, everything changed. It was one of those early spring mornings when the air carries a soft promise of warmth. I stopped by the cafe on my way to the market, the same one I've been going to for years. I'd just settled into my usual corner by the window with a steaming cup of Earl Grey when I saw him. He walked in like he owned the world, though not in an arrogant way. There was a lightness to his step, an ease. He was young, mid-20s maybe. Dark hair that fell slightly into his eyes, a sharp jawline softened by a quiet smile. His leather jacket hung carelessly over one shoulder, and he had this way of glancing around the room, like he was looking for something or someone. I should have looked away, should have sipped my tea and gone back to my book. But I couldn't. It wasn't just his looks, though he was undeniably handsome. It was something else. A spark, a pull I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I was captivated. He ordered a coffee, black, and sat 2 tables away from me. Close enough for me to notice the curve of his lips when he smiled at the barista, but far enough that I could pretend I wasn't watching him. I felt ridiculous. Here I was, a grown woman, staring at a man nearly half my age. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment of admiration. But when he got up to leave, something in me panicked. I found myself following him outside, my heart pounding in my chest. And that was how it started. 3 days of quiet curiosity. 3 days of me watching him, trying to piece together the fragments of his life, like a puzzle. I don't know what came over me those 3 days. Perhaps it was a longing I didn't recognize until I saw him, a need to step outside the shadows of my carefully constructed routine. Whatever it was, I couldn't resist it. I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong. I wasn't following him closely or invading his space. I was just observing. Yes, observing. That's what I called it. On the first day, I saw him leave the cafe and stroll through the park across the street. He walked slowly, pausing now and then to look at the trees, the birds, the world around him. He seemed so at ease, so present, like he had all the time in the world. I followed from a distance, my heart racing every time he stopped and glanced over his shoulder. I don't think he saw me, at least not yet. The second day, I spotted him again at the cafe. This time, he stayed longer, a notebook open in front of him as he scribbled something inside. A writer, maybe? Or a student? I wanted to know what was on those pages. What thoughts filled his mind? He had a way of biting the end of his pen when he was deep in thought, and it made me smile. I followed him out once more, this time to a little bookstore tucked away on a quiet street. He spent nearly an hour browsing the shelves, finally leaving with a single book, a collection of poetry. My cheeks burned as I realized we had something in common. By the third day, I could feel something shifting. He came into the cafe later than usual, and as he walked past my table, his eyes met mine, just for a moment. It wasn't much, but it felt like a spark. He smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent a thrill through me. I stayed seated, pretending to read my book, but my mind was racing. Did he recognize me? Did he notice I'd been watching him these past few days? I wanted to believe it was all coincidence, that he didn't know. But then, when he left, he lingered by the door for just a second too long, glancing back at me before stepping outside. It felt almost deliberate. That evening, as I sat by my window with a cup of tea, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about his smile, his ease, the way he seemed to carry a quiet energy that pulled me in. I wasn't just curious anymore. I was drawn to him. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel it. By the 4th day, I knew I couldn't keep hiding in the shadows of my curiosity. Watching him from afar was safe, but it wasn't enough anymore. I needed to step into his world, even if just for a moment. That morning, I put on my favorite dress, a simple navy blue one that always made me feel a little more confident, and went to the cafe earlier than usual. My hands trembled as I sipped my tea, waiting, hoping he would come in like he always did. And he did. He walked in, his jacket slung over his shoulder as usual, and his eyes immediately scanned the room. When they landed on me, something in his expression softened. He didn't look surprised, exactly, more like he'd been expecting me. This time, he chose a table right next to mine, close enough that I could hear the soft scratch of his pen against paper as he wrote in his notebook. Close enough that I could feel his presence, warm and steady, like a comforting weight in the room. I tried to focus on my book, but my eyes kept drifting to him. And then, as if sensing my gaze, he looked up. "Good book?" he asked, his voice smooth and inviting. I froze, my heart thundering in my chest. "Oh, yes," I managed to say, holding up the cover as if it could shield me from the intensity of his gaze. He smiled, a slow, easy smile that sent warmth spreading through me. "I've seen you here before," he said. "You always sit by the window." So he had noticed me. My cheeks burned, and I looked down, fiddling with the corner of my book. "It's my favorite spot," I admitted. "Mine too," he said, his voice carrying a playful lilt. "Maybe that's why I keep coming back." The conversation was brief, but it was enough to leave me breathless. When he got up to leave, he hesitated, glancing at me one last time. "Have a good day," he said softly, his smile lingering as he walked away. I sat there for a long time, replaying the moment in my mind. He had spoken to me. Not just spoken, acknowledged me, noticed me. And there had been something in his eyes, something that made me feel like I wasn't imagining this connection. That evening, as I stood in my kitchen preparing dinner, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this slip away. I had spent too many years hiding, too many years telling myself that love, excitement, and passion were things meant for other people. It was time to take a chance. The next day, I returned to the cafe, this time with a purpose. When he walked in and smiled at me, I took a deep breath and smiled back. "Would you like to join me?" I asked, my voice trembling just slightly. His eyes widened for a moment, and then that familiar, disarming smile spread across his face. "I'd love to." We sat together, talking about books, poetry, and the little things that make life beautiful. And when it was time to leave, I summoned every ounce of courage I had. "Would you like to come by my place for dinner tomorrow?" I asked, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. He paused, his eyes searching mine, and then he nodded. "I'd like that very much." The next evening I was a bundle of nerves. My small apartment, which had always felt cozy and familiar, suddenly seemed inadequate. I spent hours cleaning, rearranging, and second-guessing every detail. Was the lighting too dim? Would he think the music I chose was too sentimental? By the time the doorbell rang, my heart was racing. I smoothed down the soft cream sweater I'd chosen to wear and opened the door. There he was. His hair was slightly tousled, and he wore a dark button-down shirt that made him look effortlessly elegant. He carried a bottle of wine and a warm smile that instantly put me at ease. "Hi," he said, his voice gentle, yet filled with a quiet confidence. "I hope I'm not too early." "Not at all," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. He looked around as he entered, his eyes taking in the shelves lined with books, the framed photos on the walls, and the faint scent of lavender from a candle burning on the coffee table. "Your place suits you," he said. "It's warm. Comfortable." I smiled, grateful for his kind words, and led him to the dining table, where a simple but carefully prepared meal awaited us. We talked as we ate, our conversation flowing as easily as it had in the cafe. He told me about his love for poetry, how it allowed him to capture fleeting moments and emotions that felt too big for words. In turn, I shared pieces of my life, my years at the bookstore, the quiet contentment I'd found in routine, and the unexpected excitement he had brought into my world. As the evening went on, the air between us grew warmer, charged with an unspoken tension that neither of us seemed in a hurry to break. After dinner, we moved to the living room, sitting close together on the sofa. He noticed a book of poetry on my coffee table and picked it up, flipping through the pages until he found one that caught his eye. "May I?" he asked, glancing at me. "Of course," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He began to read aloud, his voice soft and deliberate, each word carrying a weight that seemed to settle in the space between us. I watched him, mesmerized by the way he brought the poem to life. When he finished, he set the book down and turned to me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with possibility, with questions neither of us needed to ask. And then, slowly, he reached for my hand. His touch was gentle, his fingers warm against mine. "Elena," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. "I feel like I've been waiting to meet you." His words took my breath away. I wanted to say something, to tell him how deeply I felt the same. But before I could, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss so tender it made my heart ache. I closed my eyes, letting myself melt into the moment. His touch, his presence, the way he made me feel, it was as if every wall I had built over the years had quietly crumbled, leaving me open and vulnerable in a way I hadn't been in decades. This was more than curiosity. More than infatuation. It was something real, something I hadn't dared to believe I could feel again. Time seemed to stand still as we sat there, his hand still holding mine, his lips lingering against mine with a tenderness that felt almost reverent. It had been so long since I had allowed myself to feel this way, wanted, cherished, seen. When we finally pulled apart, his eyes held mine, a quiet intensity in them that sent a shiver down my spine. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure he could hear it. "Yes," I finally managed. "More than okay." He smiled then, a slow, genuine smile that made me feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. And in that moment, I believed it. We sat there for a while, talking in hushed tones, the space between us shrinking with every word. He told me about his family, his dreams, and the way he'd felt drawn to me from the moment he first saw me in the cafe. "I couldn't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his thumb brushing lightly over the back of my hand. "There was something about you, something I couldn't ignore." His words were like a balm to my soul, soothing wounds I hadn't even realized were still there. I told him about my quiet life, about how I'd convinced myself that love was a chapter I'd closed long ago. "I was wrong," I said softly, my voice trembling with emotion. "You've made me realize that it's never too late to feel alive again." He reached out then, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering on my cheek. The warmth of his touch sent a thrill through me, and before I could second-guess myself, I leaned into him, our lips meeting once more. This kiss was different, deeper, more urgent. It was as though all the unspoken emotions between us had finally found their release. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and I felt a surge of energy that I hadn't known I still possessed. We moved together, guided by instinct and emotion, our connection growing stronger with every touch, every whispered word. It wasn't just about desire, though that was certainly there. It was about trust, about letting go of fear, and allowing myself to be vulnerable in a way I hadn't been in years. The night unfolded in a series of moments that felt both surreal and achingly real. His kindness, his attentiveness, the way he looked at me as though I were the only person in the world, all of it left me feeling raw and alive in the most beautiful way. When the intensity subsided, we lay together on the sofa, his arms wrapped around me as we listened to the soft hum of the city outside. I felt a peace I hadn't known in years, a quiet joy that came from being truly seen and accepted. In that moment, I knew this was more than a fleeting romance. It was a turning point, a reminder that love didn't come with an expiration date. The days that followed were a blur of quiet joy. I didn't need the world to understand what was happening between us, nor did I care about the questions others might ask if they knew. There was a freedom in this connection, a freedom to be fully, unapologetically myself. And with him, I didn't have to pretend. Each time we met, whether it was for another dinner at my place or a walk in the park, It felt as though the pieces of my life were falling into place. He was my companion, my confidant, and at times, he felt like my mirror, reflecting the parts of me I had long neglected, the parts that had been buried beneath years of self-doubt and fear. But as much as I reveled in our moments together, there were still times when I couldn't silence the voices in my head. Voices that told me this was impossible. That love like this wasn't meant for people like me, not at my age, not with our differences. The world would judge, and I would be left alone again, just like before. One evening, as we sat side by side in the cafe where it all began, I couldn't hold back my thoughts any longer. "Do you ever worry?" I asked, looking into his eyes, trying to find the words to explain the uncertainty that had crept into my heart. About what people might think. About us. He was quiet for a moment, his hand resting gently on mine. And then he spoke, his voice steady and sure. "I don't worry about what others think. What matters is how we feel, Elena. What matters is what we've found in each other." His words washed over me, quieting the storm inside. Maybe he was right. Maybe love wasn't meant to follow anyone's rules, but its own. Over the following weeks, I began to feel a shift within myself. I let go of the fear, the guilt, the shame I had carried for so long. And in its place, I found something more powerful: acceptance. The freedom to love without reservation. To embrace the unexpected, the beautiful, and yes, the imperfect. When I looked at him now, I saw more than just the man I had admired from afar. I saw a partner, someone who had helped me rediscover parts of myself I had long buried, parts that still had room to grow, to love, to be cherished. We didn't need to explain ourselves to anyone. We didn't need to justify this connection. It was real, and it was ours. And in that, I found the courage to keep moving forward. For the first time in many years, I felt like I was finally living, truly living, not just in the past, not just in the shadows of what I thought was possible, but in the present, with all its promise and all its beauty. I had rediscovered myself through him, through the love we shared. And I would never again let age, fear, or doubt keep me from following my heart. This was my new beginning, and I was ready to embrace it.